Awesome. Hi, I'm Omni Miranda Martone. My pronouns are they and they, and I'm the founder and CEO of the Sexual Violence Prevention Association. And today we're going to be talking about the systemic prevention of virtual sexual violence and how to be an effective digital bystander. So the agenda is to start with some definitions and framework, then we're going to move into digital bystander intervention before we talk about individual, institutional, and systemic prevention. So definitions and framework. What is digital sexual violence? Digital sexual violence is any form of sexual harassment, exploitation, or abuse that happens digitally. And so this includes deepfake or AI pornography, revenge pornography, doxing, grooming, IBSA, CSAM, and more. The definition of sexual violence is sexual violence that includes all of those things, but it's also both the result of existing power imbalances and a tool used to gain and maintain power, control, and oppression. And so this can happen on the individual, institutional, or systemic levels, or a combination thereof. And we're going to go through those individual, institutional, and systemic levels again a little bit later. And so there's three pillars of prevention. There's primary prevention, which is identifying and addressing the long-term risk factors of sexual violence. So this can prevent people from becoming perpetrators by changing their values, attitudes, and social norms, including their belief in and adherence to rape culture. And then there's secondary prevention. So this is identifying and addressing short-term or immediate threats of sexual violence. So this can include preventing potential perpetrators from taking action by challenging their beliefs, controlling the environment, and intervening before they act. And then there's tertiary prevention. So this is identifying and addressing the continuation or continued harm of sexual violence. So this is going to be preventing repeat perpetration and or continued perpetration. And tertiary prevention really bridges the gap between prevention and response. And so now we're going to talk about systemic preventions. This is where those three levels come up again. So there's the personal level, where there's individuals or interpersonal relationships. And as you can see, that's right here on the gray line here. And then there's institutional level, which is colleges, companies, and K-12 schools. And so that's on the teal line right here. And then there's at the systemic level. And so that's media, research, and policy. And so, of course, all of these things interact with each other. That's why they're all in a system. And some people have seen the ecological model usually be in a bunch of circles that are all together. But the main goal with all of that is to basically demonstrate that these are the different pillars that kind of make up a full systemic prevention strategy. So I'm going to talk about being an effective digital bystander. So bystander intervention is when a witness to digital sexual violence, online abuse, or virtual harassment prevents it from continuing and or helps the victim. And this is accomplished by noticing digital sexual violence, stepping in during an incident, and speaking out against ideas and behaviors that perpetrate rape culture. And so we're going to talk about the bystander effect. So the bystander effect is a research phenomenon that explains why people who witness a dangerous act, like digital sexual violence or deepfake pornography, why people are unlikely to step in. So for the first reason, it's diffusion of responsibility. It's, oh, somebody else is going to step in. And this assumption that, when multiple people will witness something, they all kind of assume somebody else is going to intervene, but that's not true. It's important to make sure that you're ensuring that somebody has stepped in, and if somebody hasn't, that you step in. And then there's pluralistic ignorance, which is a really, I feel like, complicated word for basically saying that nobody else thinks this is a problem. So oftentimes somebody will see something like what we saw with Taylor Swift. A lot of people shared the images of Taylor Swift, and I regularly see people share memes of politicians like Trump or AOC, who has been deepfaked, to all people like this. They'll share them and they think that it's funny, and this will often include pornography, and people don't realize it's a problem, or people do realize it's a problem, but they think nobody else and so they don't want to take action because they, as I said, they outwardly do nothing. They may feel like it's off, but they're like, oh, well, everyone else seems okay with this, so I'm not going to say anything. And then the next reason that people might not take action is ambiguity. So it's not always immediately clear that something problematic is happening. With deepfakes, for example, sometimes people don't know if they were a deepfake or not, or people might not know if something was shared consensually or without consent. But it's important to trust your instincts, and if you're unsure, to evaluate more instead of just saying, oh, well, it's ambiguous, but I'm just going to move on. And then the next one is embarrassment. And this is a bigger motivator than people realize. Oftentimes people do not intervene simply because they're worried about embarrassing themselves. And it's really important to weigh the consequences of one potentially embarrassing moment with the consequence of experiencing sexual violence or another harmful situation. And it's also important to understand that, like, standing up for something important and standing up for your values should not be embarrassing. And then the last one is fear of getting hurt. And this is a very real motivator. I'm not going to claim that this is a myth. There are situations where being a bystander and trying to take action can cause harm. And that's why we're going to go through a bunch of different options so that you can be a bystander effectively, but also safely. And so your personal safety is very important to consider. And there's a lot of ways to intervene with that won't put your personal safety at risk while still helping to diffuse or disrupt the situation. And so the 5 R's of digital bystander intervention. So it's respond, report, record, rebuke, and resource. And I want to be very clear that within these 5, these are not necessarily supposed to be going in order. You're not supposed to do each one, but you're also not supposed to just pick one. I usually would one of these options, and if it's not working, move on to another one of the options. So respond. So respond directly to the parties involved if it is safe to do so. Call out negative behavior publicly, tell the perpetrator to stop directly, or ask the victim if they are okay. Prioritize assisting the victim over debating with the perpetrator. I think sometimes people kind of get in that mindset of, I have to tell the perpetrator it's bad, and then when the perpetrator is like, I know it's bad and I don't care, or something like that, then they just keep debating with that person, but that's not necessarily helpful. And then report digital sexual violence to the social media company, the website, the browser, or the platform. If this is within a community, you can also report it to a moderator. And alternatively, if you're part of a college, a company, or a K-12 school, you can report it to administrators there. Like if this is something that's happening at the high school level between high school students, you can also report it to administrators. And then lastly, you can report to the authorities. And then record. You can record what is happening by taking screenshots, videos, or writing it down. This is particularly important in situations that will eventually involve the authorities, situations that involve children, or situations where there's a pattern of offenses where somebody's doing this repeatedly. But if you're going to choose record, make sure you're doing it in a way that is safe and that's in line with the law. So for example, if you see somebody made deepfake pornography of a child, it is not a good idea to screenshot the actual pornography. Instead, it would be a better idea to maybe write down, you can write it in an email or by hand, I saw this account with this handle share deepfake pornography on this day at this time. Or you can screenshot just who shared it or just who liked it without screenshotting the actual image itself. So once again, it's really important that you do this in a way that stays in line with the law and that's not perpetuating or worsening the situation. But it is still important to record and have some sort of footprint so that you can go back and say, if somebody does want to report or something, well, this person, did this, and it's important for us to have that information. And then we have rebuke. So rebuke digital sexual violence and challenge rape culture by calling it out, explaining why it's harmful. Keep in mind, reposting can amplify the harm by increasing visibility and engagement. It can also make you a target. So make sure that if you're going to use this strategy, that you do so safely. So for example, you can reference the content in a separate post. So this is something I saw a lot with, I'm going to keep using the Taylor Swift situation as an example. This is something I saw a lot with that situation. People were sharing the deepfake of Taylor Swift to say, this is bad, people shouldn't do this, but that was amplifying it. And that was putting it in front of more eyes. It would have been better to make a fully separate post that says, I'm sure people have seen the deepfake of Taylor Swift, and if you haven't, I encourage you not to look it up, but this is a real big problem, and here's why. And that can still be effective at making sure you're rebuking the thing that's happening without amplifying it. And then the last one is resource. You can reach out to the victim and offer resources or provide support. You can offer to provide information about how to get digital sexual violence removed. You can offer to help them go to the authorities, or you can offer to make them to help them make a report to the platform or the moderators. There's a lot of different ways you can do this, and I once again want to emphasize that these are not things you're supposed to do in order, and it's not something where you're supposed to do all 5. It's more like a menu where you're supposed to pick 1 or 2 things that seem appropriate given the situation and given what you're comfortable with. So now we're going to talk about the systemic prevention. Now that we have that baseline understanding of what it means to be a digital bystander, we're going to go back to this personal, institutional, and systemic levels of change and what we need to do to empower bystanders and to empower the systemic prevention of deepfake pornography and other forms of digital sexual violence. So we're going to start with personal prevention. Personal prevention includes individuals and interpersonal relationships. So for individuals, preventing sexual violence really comes down to values, beliefs. So that's valuing equality, respect, and kindness, and believing that digital sexual violence is harmful. So having those two things is key for somebody not becoming a perpetrator. And right now, there is a kind of commonly held belief that digital sexual violence is not harmful. I've heard this numerous times as a survivor and as a victim of non-consensual deepfake pornography. I have had multiple people say, oh, well, it's not real, so why is it so upsetting? And that's just not okay. That's not accurate. Understanding that this is harmful, that deepfake pornography and other forms of digital sexual violence are violating a victim's consent, autonomy, and privacy, understanding that and believing that digital sexual violence is harmful is very key to not perpetrating it and to be preventing it. And so then once again, valuing that equity, respect, and kindness. And so the next thing is knowledge or lack thereof. So the definition of consent, people knowing what consent is and how to ask for it is very key. So far, I think most institutions and most forms of education on consent are really about in-person interactions. And that's super important, but we're trying to talk about digital sexual violence. And I think right now, most colleges, companies, K-12 schools, or other training programs haven't really caught up to talking about what consent looks like when it comes to online forms of sexual violence. And so the next one is really accountability and motivation. So the understanding of and relationship with sex, power, and control. That is another key indicator of making sure that an individual person is not going to perpetrate sexual violence. And then opportunities for community accountability. And we're going to talk a little bit more about this, but community accountability does not always look like a criminal courtroom. Sometimes it looks like a civil case. Sometimes it looks like restorative and transformative justice. There's lots of ways that community accountability can look like, but that is a very, very big piece, is that accountability. And then the culture and community. So what is commonly accepted norms? And what is the adherence to and the belief in rape culture within this culture and this community? So that's what, those are the big pillars that make sure that an individual person will not perpetrate digital sexual violence. But then at the interpersonal level, there's parents and guardians. And so they can really address those values, beliefs, and knowledge that we spoke about on the last slide. They can make sure that their children understand what digital sexual violence is, or understand consent and how to ask for it, or make sure that they're raised with the values and beliefs that people are equal and that they should be counteracting rape culture whenever they have the opportunity. And generally, fostering an understanding of rape culture and norms is very important for parents and guardians. And then also on the interpersonal level is friends. So community and accountability is very key. Friendship is a really big, big piece of that. If a bunch of people in a friend group say, oh, that's gross, I can't believe you did that, somebody's not likely to do it again. And it's something that I think has more power than people see that it has. And fostering a culture that's free from rape culture is also important with that friendship level. This is especially big for youth because their peers are such a big motivator. And then lastly, digital bystanders in and of themselves is a form of interpersonal prevention. So it's utilizing the strategies from that first section to counteract rape culture. And when you see digital sexual violence, to step in and prevent it from spreading and or help the victim. And so then we went backwards there. Sorry, y'all. So we're going to go to institutional prevention. So institutional prevention includes K-12 schools, colleges, and companies. And so within K-12 schools, their policies, procedures, practices, and programs are super important. And I'll be referring to policies, procedures, practices, and programs as the 4 Ps from here on. So those policies, procedures, practices, and programs need to address deepfake pornography. Right now, most K-12 schools don't have anything on deepfake pornography because this has become a major issue within the past few years. It's a relatively recent issue. And thus, most schools just don't have any sort of policies. They have no procedures on how to handle it if it comes up, no policies on what to do if it happens. We really need that. And we also need prevention to be the focus. We need preventative programs for digital sexual violence and deepfake pornography. And then another key thing is that response should be part of the prevention system. So right now, when it comes to accountability or things like that, if we have restorative and transformative justice, it will be a form of prevention in and of itself. So if somebody is a victim of deepfake pornography, restorative justice makes sure that the harm is restored as much as possible to that victim. And then transformative justice says, what are the issues at hand? What caused this? What systems do we need to change to prevent it from happening in the future? And so that's really why the response and prevention need to go hand in hand. They shouldn't be 2 separate parts of this system. And so then the 4 Ps generally should cover those values, beliefs, and knowledge that we spoke about at the individual level. So that can be done through things like anti-bullying campaigns, so that making sure that children value equality and respect and kindness, and also can have social emotional learning. And then also, general sex ed can cover things like even culture and community can be conveyed through sex ed with the understanding of consent, and that consent is valued in this culture, in this community. And then generally accountability. The 4 Ps need to cover the accountability and what that institution, so what this K-12 school will do if deepfake pornography comes up. And in general, the 4 Ps should be covering the culture that they're looking to foster and should be counteracting rape culture as much as possible. And so then also within K-12 schools, one of the programs, of course, should be bystander intervention training. And so this is training on how to be an effective digital bystander. Right now, most schools, if they even have, some schools don't have a bystander intervention training program. Most schools, I would say, don't. But even those who do have a bystander intervention training program, they don't include being a digital bystander. That is very rare to see, and we need more of that. We are seeing increased rates of digital sexual violence. Deepfake pornography has been skyrocketing, and we're going to keep seeing things like this. So we need to make sure that bystander intervention includes that. And then at the K-12 schools, the focus should really be on that primary and secondary prevention, especially, I would say, ages like kindergarten through middle school, because that's really when those values and those beliefs that we were talking about before, that's really when those are being formed for the first time. And it's always easier to form, those values and beliefs in a way that is going to prevent sexual violence than to change them later on in life. And then lastly, K-12 schools can help with parent and guardian awareness. So this is really getting at that last slide where we talked about what parents and guardians can do. Well, K-12 schools can help that. They can start at a young age and build through teen years by sending home pamphlets or having, PTO meetings or anything where they're including parents and guardians in understanding what this means and how they can prevent digital sexual violence. And so then next we have colleges. So once again, we have the 4 Ps for colleges. Very similarly, they need to address deepfake pornography. Prevention needs to be the focus, and response should be part of the prevention system. Those should be a cycle that work together. This is very similar to K. Once again, they need to cover values, beliefs, and knowledge, the culture and community, and accountability. It's important for all of these things to be covered. It is very similar to K-12 schools, but I will say the programs look a little bit different because people are older. And so it's going to be a slightly different program, often more explicit about what it covers. And in general, bystander intervention training needs to be prioritized at the college level. So once again, very similarly, it needs to include digital bystander intervention training, which right now, just like with K-12 schools, most colleges have a bystander intervention training program, but it does not include digital bystander intervention, which is a very, very key thing. And then also we spoke on the last slide about how in K-12 schools, their focus should be on primary and secondary prevention. Colleges really need all 3 because people are a little bit older, but they're still developing. People's brains keep developing until they're around 25 or 26. So it's important to still have that primary prevention. And then that secondary and tertiary prevention are also really key, and colleges are a really important place to have those, the catalyst for change at those levels. And then companies. So once again, we have the same 4 Ps here. We need to make sure that companies, policies, programs, practices, and procedures, that they cover deepfake pornography, that prevention is the focus, and that the response is part of the prevention system. They have to cover the values, beliefs, knowledge, culture, community, and accountability that we discussed way back on that first slide when we were talking about individual levels of prevention. And then bystander intervention training programs need to include being a digital bystander. A lot of companies do have bystander intervention training programs, but they're mostly about in-person communication in the office. And they need to be including things like social media and other forms of digital life, because that is often where forms of digital sexual violence are happening in the office setting. And at a company level, they should be more focused on that secondary and tertiary prevention, because unfortunately, by the time most people hit the workforce and are in working in a company, they're really past that stage and that age where we can do primary prevention. We're already at the stage of secondary prevention, where it's once somebody already has those values, beliefs, and attitudes, how do we counteract them? How do we change them? Or how do we really make sure that they're challenged? And so that's it for the institutional level. Now we're going to move on to the systemic prevention. Systemic prevention includes research, media, and legislation. And so at that research level, we're going to talk again about those values, beliefs, and that knowledge or the lack thereof. So right now we need research that studies what values, beliefs, and knowledge lead to deepfake pornography. And how do we prevent or change those values, beliefs, and knowledge, once again, or lack thereof of understanding. And we also need culture and community. So research can show us which pillars and norms lead to digital sexual violence. And they can also show us which strategies can be used to shift culture and community. There's some studies coming out about this now, but I feel like until recently, most studies on culture and community shifts regarding rape culture were once again about in-person situations, but more and more of our lives are digital, especially for youth and the K-12 schools and in the college level. So we need some education about, how can we shift culture and community online? What is the driving forces that change those things? And so then we have accountability. So what are effective forms of accountability? This is like both general, so just what are general ways to have accountability for digital sexual violence? That could include civil or criminal courts, the policing system, or anything like that. But it also includes what does accountability look like within institutions and communities? So if you're a K-12 school, how do you put into your policies as a school, if somebody makes deepfake pornography, here's how we hold them accountable. It's really key that we have research showing us what are effective forms of accountability that are really going to make sure that this doesn't continue. And instead of focusing on punishment, focus on prevention in the future and focus on change. And in general, research can tell us what of the 4 Ps we need within institutions. They should really be guiding those institutional strategies so that as we move forward and as more companies, colleges, and K-12 schools develop policies, programs, and procedures and practices, that they're educated by research on what is going to be the most effective. And very similarly, that research can also show us what legislation would be effective and also what media strategies are going to be effective. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that in the next couple of slides. So media. So once again, media can be very effective at influencing those values, beliefs, and knowledge. News, TV shows, movies, books, and other media should depict the values, beliefs, and knowledge needed for prevention. So Another Body is a really great example of this. As a documentary, it is doing a great example of demonstrating, here is this super important issue. Here's how it's impacted people, and really here's why this is a problem for a lot of people. I think Another Body was one of the first introductions they had to understanding what deepfake pornography is and the harms that it causes. And then Gibby ASMR has also done a really good job as a victim of deepfake pornography of educating people on what it is and really taking action to change the values and beliefs surrounding it, that this is not okay to do to anybody, including content creators or everyday people. It's just not something that's acceptable. And then also media is really effective within culture and community. So press and media can very much shape culture by counteracting rape culture. And social media, dating apps, and other tech companies can foster a healthy community by creating effective policies, programs, practices, and procedures. So we saw this with Twitter and the Taylor Swift situation. That would not have spread as far as it did or caused as much harm as it did if Twitter had better policies, programs, and procedures to address deepfake pornography. And that's why we really need all of these tech companies and media companies to foster, healthy community by making better policies, programs, practices, and procedures. And then last, we have accountability. Media can be very key with holding people accountable, but we have to make sure that press coverage is survivor-centric and trauma-informed. I've seen a couple of stories about deepfake pornography where they shared the deepfake pornography. They might have blurred some stuff out, but it's still really not very helpful, and can sometimes, in the way that the press covers it, can actually drive more people to find the deepfake than it does address the harm at hand. So we just really need to make sure that it's survivor-centric and trauma-informed. And lastly, social media, dating apps, and other tech companies must have effective policies, programs, practices, and procedures to ensure accountability. And that's kind of tying into that last one. We really need to make sure that these platforms have forms of accountability, whether it's removing people's account, blocking their accounts, or something like that, so that this is not something that goes without accountability for perpetrators. And then lastly, we have policy. Now, legislation does nothing on its own. That's a really key thing here. All of the other things we've spoken about are effective in and of themselves at preventing deepfake pornography. Legislation, does nothing on its own. It must address something else that we've mentioned today in order to cause change. It can't do anything by itself. It simply regulates or addresses one of the other things we've talked about. So at that personal level, accountability can be found by things like the Defiance Act. That's a bill that the SUPA has led in the United States. It's been introduced in the House and the Senate, and it's a federal bill that would address and prevent deepfake pornography by creating a civil right of action so that victims can seek justice and accountability. Once again, that is at that personal level, addressing that accountability. I'm happy to talk more about it if anybody has questions. But then also at the personal level, legislation can address values, beliefs, and knowledge. And they have to do so indirectly. You can't have a piece of legislation that says everybody must value, equity, and everybody must make sure that they're counteracting rape culture. You can't have a policy that says that. It has to be a little more indirect, usually through the institutional or systemic level, like by having policies that require, for example, that schools have education programs. That's addressing knowledge indirectly. So at that institutional level, we can have legislation such as regulations so that colleges, companies, and K-12 schools have effective policies, programs, practices, and procedures. So for example, if Title IX were to come out and say all colleges must have, some form of policy and procedure to address deepfake pornography, that's a way where policy is forcing the institutions to do prevention and to have accountability. And then also at that institutional level, as I mentioned before, they can require education programs, which really addresses those values, beliefs, and knowledge indirectly at the personal level. So that's another way that legislation can effectively cause prevention. At systemic level, legislation can help fund research and listen to its findings. Also at the legislative level, it can create commissions and councils. There's actually a new bill that's going to be introduced very soon in the United States to create a commission that would be studying deepfake pornography and CSAM specifically. And that commission would, I think, be very effective at, looking at research and creating change. And then also at the systemic level, policy can regulate social media and other tech companies. We can address things like Section 230 and other ways that we need action taken within these media companies. And that's pretty much it. The main goal is to be an active bystander, make sure that you understand what it means to be a digital bystander, and to really take into account the 5 R's and implement them when needed. And generally, more broadly, to advocate for change. That's both within your personal relationships on that interpersonal level, like we spoke about, but also within the institutions that you are a part of. And then also just advocate for broader systemic approaches, whether that's advocating for bills like the Defiance Act, or advocating for regulation changes, or really just advocating for any sort of change that you can see in your community, in your institutions, or in your broader social systems. And that's all I have. I think I might have time for one question, maybe. I'm not sure that I understand this question. If anybody does have any questions, feel free to send them, because I do have like a couple minutes. And yes, somebody did ask if they could forward the material. Yeah, you can forward this. That's totally fine with me. Anything that I've shared here is welcome to be shared. Does anybody else have any questions? So somebody asked, how can we talk to teenagers about this, making the severity clear without introducing it to them as a new way to bully their classmates? That is such a good question. And that is actually something that we've talked with some administrators about. We've discussed the fact that, sometimes I think there's a fear that just telling children about deepfake, or not children, but teens about deepfake pornography is going to lead to them doing it. And that can be the case. I think it is, first of all, a risk we have to take, because I think that it's a risk that they are already facing, that they may be deepfaked themselves, and it's important for them to understand that. But then also talking to teens about, the fact that this is something that really causes significant harm, it's something that's going against consent, are all really, really key things. The best thing to do, if we can start even earlier, is start with the pillars of consent at a young age so you can build on it. But right now, the best teen sort of intervention programs that we've seen is things like just demonstrating this is somebody who usually is having a victim to speak about, this is what happened to me, this is the harms that it caused, and this is why, despite it being a fake image, it had very real implications in my life and for what was going on. And I feel that a lot of those sort of programs and this way of addressing it with teens should be paired with existing education programs on bullying and on respect and kindness and all of that stuff. So it's like this should be one of the key pieces, because I think right now we often are not seeing digital forms of bullying or digital forms of sexual violence being addressed, but there are some effective programs addressing in-person forms of bullying. And so to add this as like, this is another thing that causes real world harm, and it's another thing that's unacceptable, I think is really key. And then Haley asked, do I expect Title IX to include deepfake images and new regulations? I do not expect Title IX to include deepfakes into the new regulations. Unfortunately, these are the regulations that they've been working on for about 1.5 years, honestly, probably closer to 2 years. And so I really don't think it's going to include it. I would like it to. It's something that we have suggested when we did our public comment to Title IX. I don't think it's going to explicitly include it. but something it has included in the past was something on image-based sexual abuse, which I'm hoping that colleges will add deepfakes to that, because I think that would be very effective. And in the long term, I do hope to see Title IX include it. But unfortunately, it's taken over 2 years to get the current regulations for Title IX, so I don't have too much hope that it's coming anytime soon. But I would love to see it when it does. Unfortunately, I think that is all the time that I have. But thank you all for your questions. I'm so sorry I wasn't able to answer them. If anybody has an additional question that I did not get to, please just send me an email. My email is on the screen right now. I'm happy to answer any questions. And if you're interested about the Defiance Act or any of our other work at the SUPA, our website is right here. Thank you all so much and have a great rest of the summit.